Hello everyone, and welcome to CIS 2033 Scripting. What we will actually be learning in this class is the programming language called JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that is used to add dynamic content, dynamic behaviors to web pages. So it's a language that's focused primarily on the World Wide Web. JavaScript is one of three technologies, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, that are used to provide front-end design, front-end development for websites that are created, individual web pages that are created. And the role that JavaScript actually plays in this is that it picks up where HTML and CSS leave off, in that it allows us to provide dynamic content, dynamic behaviors to an otherwise static web page. The three technologies I mentioned before, HTML of course is the fundamental language of the web that's actually used for creating the structure of web pages. HTML's primary role is to allow us to structure the content semantically of any web page that we happen to put together. CSS then, the second of the three technologies, is there primarily for presentation's sake. CSS is what's going to allow us to define how the content of our web pages actually look. So HTML structures the data, CSS defines how it will actually appear to the end user. JavaScript then steps in as the third of these three technologies, where we can use it to define the behaviors that go along with the content, with the data. Basically anything that HTML and CSS can't do, JavaScript will be able to get done for us on our web pages. JavaScript is actually a programming language, which means that it's a computer-based language versus a human language. There are, of course, some similarities. Learning a computer-based programming language is not terribly unlike learning Spanish or French or Wookiee or something along those lines. When we actually use JavaScript, what we'll do is we'll use it to create what is called source code, which is basically just the logical use of the programming structures that the language makes available to us, that we will put down in a certain order, following certain rules, a certain syntax, so that the JavaScript that we write will then allow the web page to accomplish some goal. Could be something like dynamically showing particular pieces of content when the user mouses over a particular piece of a page, or any one of a million other things. The source code that we actually write in our programming language, while understandable to us, is not something that the computer itself can actually take and execute. So at some point before the program can actually be run, what has to happen is the source code, each individual statement that we write into our source code, has to be converted into binary so that the computer can actually understand and execute it. There are numerous different ways that this translation can occur from the source code we write to the binary that the computer can actually understand and execute. The particular technique that JavaScript uses is by passing through what's called an interpreter, so we would often say that JavaScript is an interpreted language. Given that JavaScript is an interpreted language, it might help a little bit to know a little bit about interpreted languages in general. Interpreted languages are languages where each line from our source code is converted one line at a time and then immediately executed. So if we wrote a JavaScript script that had three different statements in it, what would happen is the first line would first be converted into binary and then executed. The second line would then be converted into binary and executed. The third line, and so on and so forth. There are advantages and disadvantages to this particular way of working. Interpreted programs are typically easier to debug. The reason for that is that if at any point the computer runs into a particular problem, something that it can't understand or is incapable of doing, it's a very simple thing for the interpreter to go back and say, this is the line that was just interpreted, the line that was just translated, so this must be where the problem is. Anytime we're working with an interpreted language, we actually have to have a separate piece of software called an interpreter in general. The interpreter's job is much like a translator's job if somebody was translating between two parties that spoke different languages. Excuse me. When we talk about JavaScript, we use the word script or scripting quite a bit. We talk about JavaScript scripts, and of course script is right there in the name of the language, JavaScript. Why don't we call it interpreter Java or interpreted Java or something along those lines? Basically, the difference between pure interpretation and scripting is that when you're dealing with a scripting language, the interpreter itself is actually built into another piece of software. This other piece of software's primary role is typically not just to be an interpreter, but instead it has some other job. With JavaScript, the program that we actually use for our interpreter is our web browser. Of course, a web browser's primary task is the conversion or the rendering of HTML into a visual page. But besides that primary task, the web browser also has the ability to read and understand, convert, translate any JavaScript that we happen to write in and around our HTML, and to then have the computer carry out the actions that those statements describe. So just as a quick little example, whenever we're working with JavaScript, there's always going to be three main parts that are involved. There's always going to be the source code that we write, the interpreter, which is the web browser itself, and then typically the source code, when it's interpreted, will produce some sort of output. So in our JavaScript, for example, if we wrote a document.writeLine hello statement, when that statement was read in by the interpreter, converted into binary, and executed, it would result in the word hello, comma, the way it's written here on screen, being added to our web page. If the second line of my script was then document.writeLine hello, or I'm sorry, world exclamation point, when that line was read and translated by the interpreter, that would result in the in world exclamation point being added to the output, basically becoming a piece of content that would become a part of our web page. So, one last thing I like to talk about just in introducing people to JavaScript is I like to point out the fact that JavaScript is not Java. Java is a completely separate programming language. It's very popular. You've most likely probably heard about it or read about it on the web. But JavaScript and Java are not the same thing. So whenever you're reading, searching, talking about either of these two, it's important to be specific. JavaScript when you're talking about JavaScript, Java when you're talking about Java. There are a lot of differences between these two languages. Just a few, some of the important ones, is that JavaScript, as we just talked about, is an interpreted scripting language that's meant primarily for the web and web pages. Java, on the other hand, is a hybrid compiled language. Compiled language being one that is not interpreted, I guess would be one way of saying it. Java is used primarily for the creation, for the writing of desktop applications. You might wonder, why are the names so similar? Well, there was a bit of brief history between Netscape, the company that invented JavaScript, and Sun Microsystems, the company that invented Java, that resulted in the two names becoming very similar. But for all intents and purposes nowadays, there's nothing but a passing similarity between the two languages themselves. They are certainly not the same thing and should not be confused with one another. So let's go on to a screen now and into our text editor and see how it is that we actually write JavaScript. Okay, here's where the fun begins. As you can see, I've escaped the confines of a slideshow, and you're now looking at the text editor that I'm going to be using when I'm writing JavaScript for these demonstrations. Basically, to write JavaScript and to test it, there are two pieces of software that you're going to need. One of them is going to be a text editor, basically any program capable of creating plain text files. So any program, any application that you would typically use for writing HTML can also be used for writing JavaScript. A lot of people like to use web development or web design software, things like Dreamweaver. I personally prefer just using a good old-fashioned text editor with a few extra bells and whistles in to make things a little bit easier on me. As you can see from my screen here that I am working on a Mac. I know that a lot of you will probably be working on Windows, but that's okay. The code that we write, the tests that we perform, all of the web page work that we actually do will end up being the same no matter whether it's on a Mac or on Windows. The only thing that will really be different is the actual software that's available. My text editor here is a program that's only available for Mac called TextMate. If you are using Windows, a program I would highly recommend that you look at, my favorite text editor for Windows is a program called TextPad, which you can download from textpad.com. There you go. It's a free download. Basically, it's a sort of like shareware. If it's something that you plan on using for more than the duration of this semester, then I would recommend that you go ahead and purchase a registered copy. Last time I looked, I believe it was $25. So anyway, I have my text editor here that I'll be using, TextMate. The other piece of software that you're going to need is a web browser. The web browser that I will be using in my tests is Safari, which is the default web browser on a Mac. But again, you can use Internet Explorer on Windows if you would like, although there are, I would say, some disadvantages to developing JavaScript in Internet Explorer. What I would much more likely recommend on Windows is to get a copy of Firefox. You can get Firefox, the web browser, from getfirefox.com. That's Firefox. There we go. One of many typos that I'm sure you're going to see me make, but that's kind of the fun of the whole deal, isn't it? Anyway, Firefox has much better development tools built into it. It's much easier to write and debug JavaScript in Firefox than it is in Windows Explorer, so I would certainly recommend Firefox much more highly than Internet Explorer, especially when you're first starting off. It'll make your life a whole lot easier. Now, to actually get started, anytime you're writing JavaScript, JavaScript lives within or somewhere very near a web page. And of course, the foundation of all web pages is HTML. So pretty much anytime you're going to be working in JavaScript, you're first and foremost going to be creating a web page. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start off in my text editor by going to an option that I have that's available that will let me create an HTML template. Most of the time in this class I'm going to be working with XHTML transitional, so I'm going to go ahead and ask my text editor to create a new XHTML transitional file for me, which should hopefully be familiar to everybody at this point. You've hopefully learned about this in your HTML course or from some previous experience. I like working in XHTML because the rules are consistent and easy to understand. It's a type of file that we'll be able to validate, and I certainly would encourage you to validate any HTML files you have, regardless of whether there's JavaScript in them or not, simply to make sure that you're doing everything right the way that you're supposed to be done. HTML errors can cause problems with JavaScript, so something I also always recommend is that if you seem to be having trouble with your JavaScript, validate your XHTML document and make sure that's not an HTML problem that's causing the problem, I guess. Okay, here inside my XHTML document, I'm going to come down here to the body, and I'm going to start off by just putting in a JavaScript statement. I'm going to put in what's called a document.writeLine statement, and I'm going to ask this document.writeLine statement to write for me the text hello world. Very traditional, something along those lines. At that point, I'm going to go ahead and save my document. I'm going to do that by hitting Command S. You should be able to hit Control S and get the same results. I'm going to name my document First Test. Actually, no space in it. Spaces are dangerous in web page names. So I'm going to call it First Test. I'm a lousy typist. And I'm going to go ahead and save it onto the desktop of my computer here. All right. Here's the actual file, where it's now been saved over here to my desktop. Okay. Now, if I actually want to see that file, of course what I need to do with it is I need to open it in my web browser. So I am going to go ahead and, let's see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my web browser here, Safari. I'm then going to take that file and I'm just going to drag it here into the Safari window. And you can see that what it's actually done is it's actually displaying the JavaScript statement that I wrote as if it were simply content inside my web page, which at this point is really what it is. Anytime that we write JavaScript, one of the most important things that we need to do is we need to make it possible for the browser to be able to tell what is HTML, what is regular content of the document, and what is JavaScript. It needs to be able to tell where the HTML and content ends and re-begins, and where exactly it is that the JavaScript lives in our file. We do that in HTML by putting in what are called script tags. Just like pretty much all tags in HTML, there'll be a starting and an ending script tag. And what will happen is anytime the browser sees those tags, it will understand that whatever lies between them is to be interpreted as JavaScript code, not as regular page content. Now, generally that would be sufficient all by itself, but to continue doing this in good form, what I'm going to need to add to the beginning script tag is a type attribute, where I set the type for this set of script tags to text/JavaScript. There are other things that can also be added in here. For example, you'll often see people put in a language attribute, something like that. Okay. There's also different encoding attributes which are sometimes put in, but in general, as long as you put in this type attribute, that will be valid as far as the W3C's validator and most all web browsers are concerned. The reason that we put that type attribute in there is basically planning for a potential future case where there may become other languages that are used to fill this same role that JavaScript currently occupies. Right now, JavaScript is really the only programming language that's going to be embedded inside a web page, but in the future, other languages might come along that do the same thing. So to sort of future-proof our pages that we put together, whenever we put in script tags, we tell it that the actual type of code that it's going to find between those script tags is JavaScript code. Again, in that hypothetical future case where there might be another language, say Python for example, we might in that case put in type equals text/Python so that the browser will know whether to execute the code that's between the script tags as JavaScript or as Python. Currently, it kind of feels like a bit of a waste of time because JavaScript is the only thing that currently exists that can be put between these script tags, but nevertheless, we do it because it's good form. With these script tags now around my JavaScript statement, if I go ahead and make sure that I resave my document, switch back over to my browser, and then hit refresh, you can see what actually happens now is only the words "Hello World" show up in my browser. What's actually happened here is that the browser at this point has recognized that that line of code I wrote, this one here, is JavaScript, and it has executed it as such. So when I pulled this page up in my browser, the browser of course starts at the very beginning of the HTML file, reads down through it, taking actions whenever there's tags that tell it it needs to take actions. When it gets down to the script tags, it kicks over into sort of a JavaScript mode, executes my JavaScript statement, document.writeline hello world, which causes hello world to be output. When it is output, where it is actually outputted to is to the same place inside the HTML document where those script tags exist. So writing this, what I have here now, inside the body of my document is basically the equivalent of in HTML just writing hello world. You might wonder why in the world would I go through the trouble to type these 3 different lines just to print out the words hello world. Well, at this point I admit it is a rather silly thing to do, but you do have to start somewhere. And what will happen in the future when we discover conditional statements and such is that we will be able to have the browser decide whether it should display the words hello world or not. Or for that matter, we could have it decide that some other piece of content needs to be displayed. What's really important here is that with the logic that's going to be available to us in JavaScript as we move forward, we're going to be able to have different pieces of content dynamically added or not based on different conditions that we're going to be able to write in the JavaScript itself. One other little quick shortcut that I want to mention to you real fast is that my particular text editor, TextMate here, does have a shortcut in it where if I type the word script and then hit my tab key, it automatically fills in a set of script tags for me. Most likely from this point forward, that's what I'll be doing instead of actually typing out the script tags by hand every time. It's much more error prone that way. This is a much cleaner way of doing it. And you'll notice, of course, that whenever I put in my script tags this way or let my text editor automatically fill in my script tags, it, besides the type attribute, also puts in a character set, basically an encoding attribute there on the opening script tag. That char set attribute certainly doesn't do any harm. I haven't run into a situation yet where my JavaScript didn't work if it was left out. So since it doesn't really hurt or help one way or the other, just out of sheer laziness, I typically just kind of leave it there. What I've actually generated here in my document at this point, where I have 2 different sets of script tags, is actually a perfectly valid thing to do. You can have as many different sets of script tags inside your HTML document as you might happen to want. If I were to go down now and were to put in another document.writeline, maybe I'll have this one say, welcome to JavaScript, for example, exclamation point because it's exciting. Okay? If I actually then go back over to my web browser and hit refresh, you can see that both lines are output. Both pieces of output do become a part of the body of my document. So the fact that there were two different sets of script tags in here has not harmed anything. You can put in as many different sets of script tags as you might happen to need. Besides putting in multiple sets of script tags, you can also put them in different positions within your document. You can of course put them in and around any HTML that happens to exist inside the body, and something that will become much more common to us later is that you can also put script tags inside the head section of your document. There is a little bit of a trick, something you need to keep in mind whenever you are putting script tags inside the head of your document. If, for example, I put in the word hello, or have document.writeLine spit out the word hello for me there inside the head. If I go back to my browser and hit refresh, you can see hello does show up. But if I pull up the actual source of this page, what I'll actually see is just the JavaScript. But what would actually happen, what's actually happening here, is that this word hello that's being output is actually being output into the head section. So what I've done here with this set of script tags is just like if I had typed hello here inside the head section of my document, which is certainly not valid. So the trick that I mentioned to you before is that you can put script tags inside the head section, but the script tags that are inside the head section should not be used to actually document.writeLine anything, should not be used to actually output anything that would not be valid if you had just typed it manually inside the head section. So what I could maybe do up here that would be valid is I could put in a statement called an alert. An alert in JavaScript is going to cause a pop-up to be displayed. So if I put hello here inside this alert, go back over to my browser and hit refresh, this is the pop-up box that's generated by that alert statement. I can click OK. The browser then goes on and renders the rest of the document, and I can see all the rest of my output just like normal. While we're on the subject of where we can actually write our JavaScript, we've seen that we can put it into as many different sets of script tags as we happen to need inside the body. We can put script tags inside the head of our document. There is still actually one other place where we can put in JavaScript, and that is in an external file. Whenever you need an external JavaScript file, basically it starts off as just a plain text file, but what you put inside this plain text file is valid JavaScript statements. Basically anything I could write inside a set of script tags, I can put here inside this external file. So let me put in an alert statement, for example. I'm going to have it say, hello from an external file, exclamation point, just because I had to. By had to, I meant want to. If I then go ahead and save this external file, I'll save it as external, and by convention most people typically end the file names of external JavaScript files with a .js extension. So I'm going to save this file as external.js on my desktop, the same place I've saved my HTML file. At that point this is an external JavaScript file. Okay? The way I can actually then use that external JavaScript file is again with a set of script tags. Let me do it the old-fashioned way here. There we go. Let me put it in like this. There's my opening and closing script tag and my type attribute. But if these script tags are going to be used to access, maybe import, you might say, an external JavaScript file, there's one other attribute that I want to include here, and that is called the source attribute, src. Very similar to what you would use in an HTML image tag, for example. What I can do here is I can just put in the name of my external file. If that external file were saved in a different directory, a different folder than the HTML file, then I could also include a path here. I could, for example, say something like /scripts/ okay? In this case, since they're saved in the same location, I don't actually need any path, okay? But that line there by itself, this set of script tags with the source attribute, will import the content of that external JavaScript file and treat it as if it were actually typed right here inside these script tags. So again, if I go back over to my web browser, hit refresh, I get my original hello alert that pops up. I then get the alert that pops up as a result of the code that was imported from my external file. then the rest of the document goes ahead and renders the JavaScript executing just like normal. Okay? If you take a look at what's actually happened here, all the different JavaScript statements that we've written are executing basically in the order that they were written from top to bottom. The very first thing we saw in that last bit of output was the alert that popped up and said hello, because that was the very first JavaScript statement we had. After that, we then saw hello from the external file, because that was next. Then hello world came up, and then welcome to JavaScript came up. Those two both happened so quickly they seem to basically come up at the same time. But here, especially at the beginning, it is important to remember that by default, the browser will always execute all of your JavaScript statements in the order that they're written from top to bottom. HTML offers us a counterpart to the script tag that can be used for situations where JavaScript has been purposefully disabled in a user's browser. This counterpart tag is called the noscript tag. I'm going to go ahead and insert a couple of them here. Oops. There we go. Basically, the way that the noscript tag works is that if JavaScript is turned off in a user's web browser, then all of the normal script tags will be ignored, and instead whatever is inside the noscript tag will be shown instead. Whereas, of course, if JavaScript is enabled in the user's browser, the regular script tags will go ahead and do their normal work, and the noscript tag will be ignored. So just kind of to show you the difference here in the way that this is typically used, here inside these noscript tags, maybe I'll put in a paragraph. And inside that paragraph, I'll put in, you need to enable JavaScript in your browser for this site to function. Something like that. Typically, the noscript tag is used for giving a warning to the user, letting them know that JavaScript needs to be enabled in their browser in order for the site to function. Depending on exactly what work you have JavaScript performing in a web page you put together, sometimes it may be crucial that JavaScript be enabled. Sometimes the site may be able to get by without it. So it's really up to you as to whether the noscript tag is included in your pages or not. I usually go ahead and put it in though, just to make sure the users know that they are not receiving the full experience of the web page because JavaScript has been disabled. To go ahead and show you how this works, I'm going to go ahead and save what I have. If I jump back over to my browser now and hit refresh, everything happens exactly the same way that it did before. There's absolutely no sign of the noscript tag at this point. But if I were to come up and go into the preferences of my browser, in here I can disable JavaScript. Just have to remember where it is. There we go. Okay. I'll disable JavaScript. Okay. When I now go back to my page and hit refresh, you can see that all of the work that JavaScript had been performing before is now not happening because JavaScript has been disabled, but in its place we're now able to see the content of the noscript tag. If I go ahead and turn JavaScript back on in my browser, refresh again, everything goes right back to normal. JavaScript doing its normal work and the noscript tag basically not evident anywhere on the page. While we have this code here sitting in front of us, there are a few other things about JavaScript that are very fundamental that I want to go ahead and point out to you. One of them is that most all of the JavaScript expressions that we write are going to end in a semicolon. I'm certainly not saying that every single JavaScript statement will end in a semicolon, but you'll find that most of the regular typical expressions that you write do end in that semicolon. It can be a little bit tricky in JavaScript because the semicolon is not strictly required. It can actually be left off, and in a lot of situations the JavaScript will still work just fine. But every once in a while you will run into a situation where if the semicolon is missing, the JavaScript will start to misbehave. So just sort of as a rule of thumb, I generally make a point of ending every appropriate statement with a semicolon, even if it doesn't technically have to always be there. And I'd recommend you do basically the same thing. One other little detail that I wanted to point out was something about the style that I've been typing in here. It's generally called pretty printing. Basically what it means is whenever a new statement is written that's enclosed inside a set of tags or inside another JavaScript expression or statement, we simply indent those included statements. So you can see that inside the body of my document, I've indented everything one tab. Inside each set of script tags, I've indented each one of the statements inside those tags by one more tab. It's not something, again, that's required. As you know from your HTML course, the browser is not space sensitive in really any way. But it does contribute greatly to the readability of your code. Makes it much easier for you to keep track of what's going on and where, which statements belong with and inside other statements. It makes it a lot easier for other people to be able to read your code. So again, it's something that I strongly recommend. If you run into code that looks something like this, where everything is simply left justified, it very quickly gets very confusing, and you'll find that you make a lot of mistakes simply because you're misinterpreting what particular statements are supposed to be doing, where it is that they actually belong. The next thing I wanted to go on and talk about is the sort of interaction, I guess you could say, between JavaScript and HTML. We know that JavaScript resides inside an HTML document, or near an HTML document, you might say, if we're talking about a situation where the JavaScript is being imported from an external JavaScript file. We know that the JavaScript is typically inside script tags. One thing I haven't mentioned to you yet, though, is the fact that we cannot put plain HTML inside our script tags. If I were to say put a set of H1 tags that said hello world here inside JavaScript tags, this would certainly not work at all. If I go ahead and try and run an actual JavaScript statement after that, I'll just have it say hello. When we go and we try and pull that up in our browser, you see that nothing at all actually happens. What has actually occurred here is that the inclusion of the HTML inside the script tags has thrown off the JavaScript parser, the part of the browser that actually reads and understands the JavaScript. It doesn't at all expect to find HTML inside the script tags, so when it ran into it, it didn't know what to do, and basically sort of abandoned the attempt. If I go ahead and get rid of the HTML that I included there and go back and run it in my browser, you see that the JavaScript in this case works just fine. So we can't actually put plain HTML inside the script tags, but one thing we can do is we can actually have JavaScript output HTML tags. I could, for example, put a set of H1 tags here inside the content of what's actually being output into the content of the document. If I go back and I look now, you can see that the style of the word hello has changed because it's now being output with those H1 tags around it. There are actually a lot of different ways that this can be done. The way I just did it is one of them. There's many others. Basically, none of them are particularly more right than any others. It's just sort of a matter of style and whatever happens to work best for what you're currently writing. Something else that I could do here is I could print out the H1 tags as separate document.writeLine statements, which you can see in the browser ends up causing the exact same thing to happen. The word hello basically inside a set of H1 tags. If you need to have JavaScript output some little piece of information and there's a lot of complicated HTML that goes along with it, then another fun little trick you could do is to actually just enclose the entire set of script tags inside a set of HTML tags, something along these lines. So when the browser reads this, it'll see the opening H1 tag. It will then execute the JavaScript, which will output the word hello, making it a part of the content of the document. It'll then see the closing H1 tag, so it will in effect be the exact same thing as if I had typed this in HTML, except of course, as we've mentioned previously, the power of JavaScript will be much more evident later when we can dynamically have it decide whether it actually is going to output the word hello or not, or possibly have it choose to output something different. But with the way it's written right now, you can see it's the exact same effect and everything works just fine. Like all programming languages, JavaScript allows for comments to be included in the code that you actually write when you're creating the JavaScript for a web page. Basically what a comment is a line or a series of lines that are put inside your script tags in the case of JavaScript comments that will be ignored by the browser when it goes through and it executes the rest of the JavaScript that is around the comment. Comments are excellent for being able to leave yourself reminders, basically as sort of a form of documentation for yourself or for other people who may later come and look at your code. There are actually two different types of comments that we can include in JavaScript. One of them is called a block comment. The other is called a single line comment. So let me show those two different types of comments to you here. Basically what I have here in this example is I have a paragraph here at the beginning of my body that displays the word hello, just as regular old HTML content, and then inside a set of script tags I'm using a document.writeLine to display the word user right now. The idea would be that later, maybe in the future, a user would be logged in, my JavaScript would have access to the name that they logged in under, and instead of displaying the word user here, I could instead display their actual username. So what I could do here, for example, is maybe include a block comment describing what my intentions are for this particular JavaScript statement. A block comment in JavaScript starts with a /* and ends with an */. Anything that I put between those two symbols then will be ignored by the browser when it executes this segment of JavaScript. Basically, this constitutes a comment. So I'm going to say to do retrieve the username and display it here in place of user, something along those lines. The other type of comment that we can include in JavaScript is called a single line comment. A single line comment always begins with a /. The way a single line comment works is everything from the // until the next time you press the enter key, basically until the end of the line, will be treated as a comment and ignored by the browser. So here I could say something like open a new set of h1 tags. Okay. Single line comments are great for doing just this sort of thing, throwing little comments on the end of statements that are written. They also, of course, can be on a line where they just sort of stand by themselves. I could put one in here and say, welcome user to JavaScript, something like that. Basically wherever they happen to be needed. Single line comments, both type of comments really, also have another purpose, not something they were really intended for, but something that really comes in handy with them, and that is that they can actually be used for debugging. If I had a problem with my script, I could actually use comments to selectively remove lines without actually having to erase them and retype them again later. I could remove these lines from my script to see if those are the lines that are actually causing the trouble. So for example, if I take a look in my browser right now, everything is working just as it should, but if I come back and purposely introduce an error into my code, maybe for example I'll get rid of one of these double quotes around user. If I then go back to my browser and hit refresh, you can see that generally things look like they're working pretty okay, but the word user has disappeared. That's a pretty mild case. If I had a situation where a mistake I had made, a syntax error that I had introduced, was causing a severe enough problem that it was stopping the rest of the script from running, one of the things I could do is I could just comment out a line that I suspected as being the troubled one, and then could rerun the script and see if that made any difference, see if it allowed the rest of the script to go on running. In this case it doesn't make much difference one way or another, but the use of comments as a debugging tool in that way is something that you might want to keep in mind.